Today we will start the actual explanation of the CIPS L4 methodology. We will start with the first book, L4M1, Scope of Influence of Procurement and Supply. Chapter 1. Understand and analyze the added value that can be achieved through procurement and supply chain management. We said that the first chapter consists 4 topics. Topic 1. 1.1 Compare the concepts of procurement and supply chain management. Topic 2. 1.2 Analyze the different sources of added value in procurement and supply. Topic 3. 1.3 Describe the categories of spend that an organization may purchase. And Topic 4. 1.4 Differentiate the stakeholders of procurement or supply chain functions. Today we will start explaining the first topic. 1.1 Compare the concepts of procurement and supply chain management. The first topic consists of 6 points, as we mentioned earlier. The first point, 1.1.1 Definitions of procurement, supply chain management, and supply chain networks. The second point, 1.1.2 Compare the role and function of supply chain management with procurement. The third point, 1.13 Definition and function of supply chain tiering. The fourth point, 1.1.4 Definition and issues related to complex supply chains. The fifth point, 1.1.5 Definitions of logistics and materials management. Finally, the sixth point, 1.16 Definitions of waste management and closed-loop recycling. Today's explanation method will be in 2 directions. The first direction is by presenting a practical example through which the first topic is fully explained. The second direction is by going over what the book covers to explain this topic. Let's start together with the first direction. Let's assume that there is a company that owns a large administrative tower, and the company is furnishing the tower. The required furniture is offices for employees, plus wooden cabinets, office chairs. The required furniture is 300 offices for employees. The company's purchasing department contacted many furniture suppliers. Quotes were obtained and all negotiation procedures with suppliers were completed. 4 purchase orders were issued to 4 suppliers due to the large size of the purchase order. The required furniture is to be supplied within 90 days from the date of the purchase order. Let's share a supply chain network model. This is a model for designing a supply chain network. We mentioned that the company sent purchase orders to suppliers. The suppliers sent to the manufacturers to supply the required furniture. Let's assume that the manufacturers do not have the required furniture, meaning that the factory needs raw materials to manufacture the furniture. Let's see together how the subject is done. Procurement involves obtaining something. Could be tangible, like goods, or intangible, like services. In the previous example, the company requested tangible materials, namely office furniture. Procurement process begins by identifying a need, and procurement process completes once the goods or services that meet that need are delivered. In the example, the customer requested furniture from suppliers. The suppliers, due to their lack of furniture, sent to manufacturers to supply. The manufacturers began to collect raw materials for manufacturing from suppliers to manufacture the furniture and deliver it to the customer. From this example, the first topic, which was 1.1.1 Definitions of procurement, supply chain management, and supply chain networks become clear. Procurement is a strategic function. Purchasing and supply are functions within the procurement process. Purchasing is the act of physically ordering and buying something. Supply is the infrastructure which ensures that products or services get from the supplier to the customer. From the example, the infrastructure here is the flow of the materials from the raw materials suppliers till deliver the goods to the customer. Without procurement, there could be no purchasing, and without purchasing, there would be no supply. Let's move on to, what is a supply chain? Supply chain are integral to a well-functioning procurement operation. They must be managed in order to be effective. A supply chain may be simple or extremely complex. A supply chain involves a network of individuals, organizations, technology, activities, and resources to make sure goods and services flow along the chain. If one part of the chain fails, every organization further along the chain can also fail. You see the screen. This is a supply chain. From Tier 1 to Tier 2, from Tier 2 to the manufacturers. Another supply chain from the manufacturers to the warehouses, and another supply chain to the distributors. Then supply chain to the distributors' warehouses. Then the warehouses through another supply chain to the retailers. And finally, the retailers through another supply chain deliver the materials to the end user, the customer. These are the supply chain. Supply chains start with raw material producers in yellow, followed by suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and finally the end consumer, the customer. Supply chain consists of two stages, upstream and downstream. Upstream, the supply flow of raw materials, components, parts, etc. needed for production. Downstream, the supply chain that the organization feeds into from product to end user. Let's move on to supply chain management. For a supply chain to work effectively, it has to be managed. The process will not function effectively without procurement involvement to ensure all aspects of the chain are performing correctly. Supply chain management, SCM, aims to reduce cost, improve value, and reduce risk. The supply chain must operate efficiently, and procurement must be present and involved. When the supply chain operates efficiently, costs are reduced, value added increases, and risks are reduced so that materials reach the customer safely. Supply chain management, SCM, also involves managing customer relationships. The supplier is a customer of the raw material producer, the manufacturer is a customer of the supplier, the distributor is a customer of the manufacturer, and the consumer is a customer of the distributor. There is only ever one consumer in a supply chain, the end user. Let's move on to supply chain network. A supply chain is the process of mapping out how raw materials are manufactured and how they are delivered to the consumer. A supply chain network, SCN, is an extension of a supply chain. Individual supply chain is part of supply chain networks. A supply chain network would include all other parties involved in the process. Supply chain networks are usually designed around 5 areas. 1. External suppliers, who is going to provide materials to make the goods or services. 2. Manufacturers, who is going to produce the end products. 3. Distribution, wholesale centers, who is going to manage the storage and transportation of the products. 4. Logistics, who is going to ensure that everything is where it should be at the required time. 5. Consumer demand. Do the intended individuals have a need or desire for the end product? Now, we finished the first topic, which was 1.1.1, definitions of procurement, supply chain management, and supply chain networks. Now we move on to the second topic, which is 1.1.2, compare the role and function of supply chain management with procurement. We mentioned earlier that supply chain and procurement are related but not the same thing. Procurement involves 2 steps. First, there is a request, and then the products reach the customer, and here the products are obtained. The supply chain is the infrastructure that ensures the obtaining of products and services. This is the difference between supply chain and procurement. Procurement includes the followings: preparing specifications, monitoring quality, sourcing, buying, stock control, disposal of waste. Now we move on to the third topic, which is 1.1.3 Definition and Function of Supply Chain Tiering. The supply chain levels are a hierarchical arrangement of suppliers and their organization. This is a hierarchical arrangement of suppliers. Here is the manufacturer, and this is the first level. This is all considered the first level. Here's the second level of suppliers. It may contain levels and tiers of suppliers as we mentioned previously. This is considered the first tier, and this is considered the second tier. The tiers are linked to each other like a chain. As you can see, there is a connection between the manufacturers and the first tier and the second tier. A lower tier number means the supplier is closer to the buyer. This is tier number 1, and this is tier number 2. Of course, it is very clear that tier number 1 is closer to the buyer, which is the factory. Now let's see together the benefits of supply chain. It allows for development based on fewer suppliers, meaning that the fewer suppliers the first tier has, the more you can develop those suppliers, and at the same time improve relations with suppliers, and supplier relations go well. As for the risks in the supply chain, buyers are more susceptible to risk factors, including compliance, ethics, and sustainability, from suppliers outside of Tier 1 as they have less visibility and control over the supply chain. Meaning here in the manufacturer, I can see the first tier of suppliers, and from here I can set standards, laws, and regulations that I oblige the first tier of suppliers to follow so that they are compliant and can be our suppliers. In the event that the supplier violates the standards, I can exclude him from supplying and coin, because there are other reliable alternatives, and because of the close relationship with the first level suppliers and the exchange of benefit and profit, which forces them to comply with the standards set by us. But the large number of tiers of suppliers leads to a loss of control over the suppliers. Here I can control the supplier from the first tier close to me, and I can know how he manages the work and what are the standards he works by and whether he is committed to me or not. The second tier is far from me, which means that there may be a partial loss of control over the suppliers of the second tier, so maps of the levels must be drawn in order to mitigate the risks. These are the supply chain maps. Now we move on to the fourth topic, which is 1.1.4 Definition and Issues Related to Complex Supply Chains. The supply chain shown in front of you on the screen is a very small model. For example, in practical life, when you order from a site like Amazon, for example, you imagine that you are ordering and you will receive it within 3 to 5 working days. Can you imagine how the order arrives? The order arrives through a supply chain network like the one shown before you on the screen, but the issue is more complicated for them. This is because the required materials may be located within the city you are from, in a governorate next to it, or in a distant governorate, and in materials that may be outside the borders of the country in which you reside. You can imagine the size of their supply chain needed to provide your order. Now let's move to the issues related to complex supply chains. Within a complex supply chain, every supplier tier is managed, and each has to conform to the same ethical and sustainable standards. Like what was mentioned previously, here is the manufacturer. This is a first tier for suppliers, and this is a second tier for suppliers. You must manage all tiers of suppliers, and they must meet your ethical and sustainable standards. The manufacturer will conduct supplier audits on the entire chain network from time to time, but may also rely on the Tier 1 supplier to ensure the lower part of the chain is well managed, to avoid exposure to the risk factors discussed in the supply chain tiering section above. Here, the manufacturer is able to audit the suppliers at the first tier because they are close to me and there is direct contact with these suppliers. Sometimes we may rely on suppliers at the first tier to audit suppliers at the remaining tiers of supply. They manage the bottom part of the supply in order to avoid risks. It is the responsibility of the manufacturer to ensure each tier of its supply chain conforms to organizational standards as well as any external regulations or legislation. This means that I do not only look at the first tier to ensure that it is compatible with my standards and legislation, but I am also responsible for ensuring that the remaining tiers adhere to regulatory standards, regulations, and legislation. I cannot place responsibility on first-level suppliers. This cannot happen. You will be held accountable if a customer learns that at one of the supplier's supply tiers, they found some organizational problems or regulations, or does not comply with legislation, or uses child labor, for example, or has problems with environmental pollution. In this case, you will be held accountable for dealing with these suppliers. Now we move on to the fifth topic, which is 1.1.5 Definitions of Logistics and Materials Management. What is logistics? Logistics is the process of planning, implementing, and controlling procedures for the efficient and effective transportation and storage of goods, including services and related information, from the point of origin to the point of consumption for the purpose of conforming to customer requirements. Can you imagine what the logistics are like? Logistics begins with the process of planning the materials to be delivered to the end user. Where will it be supplied from? This supplier or that? You not only plan for the suppliers at the first tier, but also look at the distant tiers. You must also monitor the supplier at the first tier, what he did to meet the demand, and how he communicated with the suppliers at the second tier. You must also have control over the supplier at the first tier and the supplier at the second tier. You must also monitor the materials that the second-tier supplier delivers to the first-tier supplier and how he stores the materials so that these materials do not become damaged or destroyed. Also, the handling from the supplier in the second tier to the supplier in the first tier and how the supplier in the first tier delivers the materials to me. The transfer process between tiers must also be monitored, as the chain will continue to deliver finished materials to the manufacturer's warehouses until it then distributes them to distributors in the various governorates, followed by storing the goods in the distributors' warehouses so that the materials are close to the retailers, so that the materials are ready when the customer requests these materials. The most important person in the supply chain is the end customer. We are all working to deliver the materials to him. So logistics is the control of the goods or services between 2 points. It is about making sure that people or things are where they need to be at the correct time. The speech is clear and direct. Everyone must be in the right place for the process to proceed effectively. Logistics services are divided into internal logistics services or external logistics services. Internal logistics include the processes that are related to turning the raw material into the desired end product. Internal logistics is the transformation of raw materials into finished products. Here, raw materials go to the suppliers and then to the manufacturer to transform them into finished products and deliver them to warehouses. Or it may be external logistics services that include distribution, transportation, and retail. Logistics requires several areas to be managed in order to keep the entire process running effectively. The first point is demanding planning. The meaning is very clear, which is knowing what is required and when. Here the client is requesting office furniture, and it is clear what is required. And when he wants to receive it, for example, the customer requests the supply of furniture within a maximum of 3 months and no more than that. Within logistics, it relates to understanding what products are coming from where and at what time, as well as knowing where they need to go to and when. It must be clear to us where the required product will be supplied from and when, how and when it will be supplied. Demand planning can be achieved by working closely with other organizations in the supply chain and ensuring good and accurate communication. From here, it is clear that communication within the chain must be very precise and closely related so that things go smoothly and communication is good and accurate. The next point is fleet management. Can you imagine the success of this series without fleet management? An impossibility for sure. Fleet management is a broad term covering the solutions an organization uses to physically transport goods from one place to another. There is a fleet that transported materials from the second tier to the first tier. There is a second fleet that transported materials from the first tier to the manufacturer. The factory transported them to warehouses. It was then transported to the distributor. It was then transported to warehouses, then transported to retailers, and finally transported to the customer. These are the solutions for transporting materials from one place to another. Fleets can be a number of vehicles owned by an organization if it runs its transport in-house, or they can be vehicles owned by a specialist company if the organization opts to outsource. But the most obvious disadvantage is a loss of control. There are some companies that focus only on their main activity, which is manufacturing. However, for services such as transportation and storage, some companies set their own standards, laws, and regulations and offer competition to companies working in this field to submit their offers. Through these offers, companies that suit their standards are selected. In this case, these companies can be used to manage the fleet. They can also be used in the storage process. But sometimes some problems may occur. There are many companies that have succeeded in this matter, and from here we cannot generalize the problems. Now, let's move to inventory management, warehousing, and order fulfillment. Inventory management involves knowing how much inventory stock is available. You are here, manufacturer. You must be aware of the available stock in the warehouses. Products should be stored in the correct way within warehouses. Warehouses should be laid out in a way that makes product selection quick and easy. Good warehouse designs include clear labeling or barcoding in the racking to enable products to be found effortlessly. If products cannot be found or are not in the right quantity, the distribution element of logistics cannot happen, and orders can be left unfulfilled. In this situation, the supply chain process would fail as the consumer would not receive their goods. You are here, the manufacturer. You must be aware of the available stock in the warehouses. Imagine that the materials may be available to you in the warehouse, but due to poor storage and poor design of the warehouse, there are no signs or barcodes on the materials, and when you request materials from the warehouse, the response is that the materials are not available. Imagine that you wasted time and money, and at the same time, there could be a delay in delivering the materials requested by the customer. A very simple thing is how to store materials correctly in the warehouse, which will definitely save you a lot of problems. Now we will move to what is materials management. Materials management is a part of the supply chain and is concerned with the flow of materials to, from, and inside manufacturing production units. It covers the planning, handling, storage, inspection, and issuing of raw materials, components, and finished goods. The last point for today is 1.1.6 Definitions of Waste Management and Closed-Loop Recycling. Waste is simply scrap. Waste is a wide-ranging term encompassing most unwanted materials. Waste can be materials, substances, or byproducts. You are a factory that manufactures products. Some of these products may be scrap at the end of production. Scrap may be materials or byproducts. Waste management encompasses the strategies organizations use not only to dispose of waste, but also to reduce, recycle, and prevent it from occurring in the first place. If an organization is found to have acted irresponsibly in its disposal of waste, it could suffer reputational damage too. In many cases, there will be specific legislation relating to high-risk products and substances, for example with toxic chemicals and gases or electronic equipment. What are the benefits of effective waste management? Compliance with regulations, meaning less risk of fines, penalties, or reputational damage. Positive impact on people, the planet, and its resource. Enhance brand reputation, meaning organizations, stakeholders, and suppliers will want to work with you. Cost saving associated with the elimination of unnecessary waste from the supply chain. One of the best ways to reduce waste is through the use of closed-loop recycling. What is closed-loop recycling? Closed-loop recycling is where recycled waste can be reprocessed or repurposed indefinitely to make either new products or return to the environment as biodegradable waste. Thank you all for your time, and we will see you in the next lectures soon.